Thanks for staying with the show tonight. Now, do we have too many protests in South Africa? Some say it could be a sign of a strong democracy. Others seem to think the frequency of protests in the country has perhaps lessened their effectiveness. So, which is true? We speak to Seth Mazibuko, who many of you would know, a prominent activist, part of the 1976 generation and the June 16 protests, and Modise Siavi, an activist from the Fees Must Fall movement. So, certainly two individuals. No, you see, I feel like we need an extra person here, because this conversation might be skewed in another direction, but I'll allow it to get there. I won't assume that I know the position you'll go for.
Okay.
So let me thank you both for joining us tonight. So you can have boycotts, you can have forms of civil disobedience, you can have hunger strikes, you can have demonstrations, occupations, petitions, you know. All of these are just part of the examples of protest that people can take. And certainly in South Africa, I think we go through our fair share of each of those in a year. I know the hunger strikes are particularly popular in prisons. You know, generally when the prisoners stage a protest, they'll go for the hunger strike. But how effective are they? And of course, we ask this in a context where in the country, it's almost guaranteed that anywhere in South Africa, at least 1 week, there is a protest that is taking place. And
not only is it guaranteed, last week, 2 weeks back, there was a judgment in Cape Town whereby it was you don't even have to seek permission.
Yes, anymore.
To be in, I mean, to go out in the streets. But yeah, I'm just trying to say it has become. I come from prison. I come from Robben Island. In Robben Island, hunger strike will be the main one. And the other time, I was watching, you know, women making their point to be heard, raising up their panties, and it is another form of a protest. And you have different. Others take out to the streets. Others become very, very violent and very destructive. But the question becomes, it's just that it's a form of expression, and that is allowed by law.
Given the fact that it is a form of expression, the question we, of course, are dealing with today is whether or not this form of expression is impactful and successful in South Africa today. The one thing we have seen is that constantly protesters keep pushing the boundaries. So before it was, we'll light up one bus. Now we'll set the whole 10 on fire. The next time we'll set the bus, the school and the library on fire. And, you know, the boundaries almost keep being pushed to the extreme. So does that mean that they have impact?
I mean, they definitely have an impact. Have we had enough protests? I don't think so. At some point in time, we need to get to a point where a protest happens and essentially shuts down this country, because protests to a large extent are an extension of the contradictions within society. The reason why people engage in protests is because, one, they want to be seen, they want to be heard, and to a large extent they aren't getting the attention that they deserve, or that the matter deserves, that they're protesting about, from government and from people who tangibly can make a difference. So in this country, especially under this supposed new dawn, we are going to see more protests coming out. This is not just about service delivery. This is not just about land redistribution without compensation, but this is about the fabric and the identity of not only black individuals within the country, because let's be honest, most of the time the people who are protesting are the poor, black, marginalized masses of our people. And that on its own is an expression of, you know, the frustration and the build-up to a climax that I don't believe that this country is ready for. So are they ignored? Yes. Are they effective? Not as yet. And that's why we see an escalation of the kinds of protests that people engage in.
So then should people still be protesting? By the first quarter of the year, we had about 144 protests on record, first quarter of the year. So those people will continue to protest, but obviously the reason why they have to keep protesting is because what they're doing is not working. So then what should be the alternative means? And should there be an alternative means? Because protests, especially these days, even to make it onto the news, it has to be really something out of the ordinary, different to what we're seeing perhaps in Honeydew, where residents protest every other week over the same issues?
Maybe let's go back. As a 1976 generation, it was that protest in June 16, 1976, that led, to Bantu education being, brought down, and maybe to the fees must fall. It is also part of what brought down fees must fall. But the point I'm trying to put across is this, that the impact might be different. It depends on who the protest is directed to. Sometimes it is trade unions showing their power on an issue that has got to do with a labor issue. Dispute. And sometimes then you have students who are not being listened to, then who want to make their point. And the only power that they have is the power of the masses, of the students out there, showing that now we are there. And women, children, and all that. We are in the 16 days of activism. We just marched with children, showing, the abuse of children by men, So I'm trying to say protest, on the other side, it is in the receiving end.
And did you hand out a memorandum at this march?
Yes, we did.
To who?
To the police.
Okay. And when are you expecting a response from the police?
Within the next 14 days, and let me tell you, we are not going to get it. We are not going to get it.
It's going to happen in the next 14 days.
So then, does that mean that, in your view, is it impactful?
We've made the point. And another thing we have raised, even, you see, protests are not only, just to protest. You also are raising the conscience of people on an issue. You are saying to people, this is a big issue, and women are being abused, children are being abused, are being killed. But at the same time, you are saying this must stop. And when you go to the police, you're saying to the police, you are not doing your work. And in 14 days.
Outside of doing your work, I mean, we're going to have a very genuine conversation if we're going to attempt to discuss protesting, because to a large extent also protesting, what it does is it unveils the so-called freedom that we've gotten as a democratic dispensation. Every time there is a protest, there's a response from the state, right? And that response is always a violent...
Well, we hope, not every time, but
in most instances. I mean, from a lived experience, as a young activist within the space, even my first encounter with activism has been one that has been met with violence to a large extent. And this is what happens, in various communities. And when that violence is expressed onto the citizenry by the state, what happens is beautiful, because you see social cohesion happening. You see a community of people come together under specific ideals, and more than anything, that gives a testament as to the fact that South Africans are willing to participate in their own citizenship. They are willing to challenge, this democracy. They're willing to challenge and to attain the things that they need in order to truly be free. But in order to do that, they need to go through the exercise of protesting, because a lot comes out of protesting. There's organizing in protesting. There is trying to keep masses together. There's a political education that goes into protesting. So there's a lot of work around protests, and people just assume that you wake up in the morning, decide to go stand in the middle of the road, and then call it a protest, and all hell breaks loose. But there's a lot of conscientization that happens, and there's a lot of social cohesion.
And to the extent, very briefly, we've got a caller on the line that I want us to take us to the extent that then once that, that show of support has been, galvanized in the streets and everything has been shut down, and yet months later, nothing has changed, what then is the true impact of a protest such as that?
So the true...
Okay.
We'll allow all people to go first.
She's being ageist.
Okay. Can you just say this? You do have instances where protests do bear fruit. You do have instances where protests do not, where you are not being listened to, where you have to take sometimes a protest to another level. She said, you plan these protests. You plan a protest in a milder way. it could be.
But does it, you know, part of your point, does it not come down also to, and you remind me of Fees Must Fall, where we had the conversation around, you know, the assistance in terms of higher education, and people would raise the point that students at TUT had been protesting over issues like this for years, and their concerns had gone unnoticed. And yet suddenly when you had these other more revered institutions taking up the cause, then suddenly it seems to gain, you know, the eye of the powers, or the ear of the powers that be. So does that play a role in terms of where is this protest happening? Is a protest in rural Guyana going to get the same kind of response to a protest in that shuts the M1 highway?
Actually, you've suggested.
That depends on two things, actually. Okay. I'm actually going to interject. It depends on two things. One, it depends on whether the protest is about attaining short-term goals or achieving long-term goals. So, for an example, with Fees Must Fall, when TUT and University of KZN had been protesting in the 90s already for free education, for it to be picked up now, it meant that they were in a strategically long-term protest, right? So that we were able to pull that to a large extent. But protests that happen in small villages over service delivery, like Guyana, want immediate responses. And when they do not receive those immediate responses, then the first question becomes, where's the media, to a large extent? Because when the media becomes involved and essentially highlights a lot of what is happening within these communities, there is some sort of a response from government. Because our government doesn't like delivering services, but they like looking like they can, right? So it's about the image also of the state in this new democratic dispensation.
He's got his hand up there, yes.
You're talking about rural areas. I mean, we just had Vembe, we just had schools in the northern, what is this, in Limpopo, where there was almost a shutdown of schools and people were making their point through protest. And that protest is now listened to. Some people are now starting to say, let us talk to these people. And when they started very small. They started, it's an issue, it will end. It's just an energy, you know, they've just taken Eno, and then it will subside. At some point when they see, and particularly our government sometimes take, because they wake up to protest every morning, they then say, okay, it will die. But the point is that it also happens now lately, even in rural areas, the only voice that seems to be heard is the voice of the people out in the streets, out in protests, out, you know, shouting slogans and saying, we don't want a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
All right, I'm going to come back to you in a moment. Mr. Mohlahlana, I hope I've gotten that right, calling us from Uppington. Sir, good evening.
Good evening, Cathy. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. What do you have to contribute to our conversation tonight?
It's a pleasure having me, Cathy. Even for your guests there in studio also. Cathy, we need to understand one thing that in our society. We need to understand one thing. We need to differentiate the fact that we must not have rural people and we have city people. That's the one aspect that you need to get away with. The other aspect is when protesting, you need also to see that you are not infringing other rights of other peoples while doing your protest. The third aspect is this. Our government was taken by means of protest. And by 1976, the protest of then and now should be different totally as we are speaking now. So the fact that I'm raising the fact that different people of the cities, people of the rural areas, most people at the rural areas don't have universities. They are going to the university at the cities. So what is happening? People must now behave in a certain way that they are there for the true concept, for education purpose. Now, if they are going to protest for the university at the cities, people who are going to be on the advantageous side are people at the cities, not at the rural area, for the mere fact that they at the rural areas don't have universities. At Johannesburg, the university is going to be upgraded. That's my point. Kathy.
All right. Thanks for that, Mr. Mohlahlana, calling us from Uppington, certainly saying that there isn't a classist differentiation in terms of protest. I'm not sure I completely agree with that.
Yep, I don't too. But I'm trying to say protest can be protest anywhere.
So is it a good thing, the fact that we're having as many protests in South Africa as we are today?
Actually, it's an expression of democracy.
Is it a good thing?
It's not a good thing. I don't believe it's a good thing. We also have to take into cognizance what happens in that protest, the mental health of the people who engage in that protest, right? Because there's a lot that happens in protests. It's not just what we see on TV. To a large extent, a lot of people get physically injured. A lot of people have mental health issues that last after the protest. And that on its own becomes problematic not only in their own homes, but in the community and in society altogether.
And Mr. Mazibuko, you've suffered part of that trauma. So why do you think it's a good thing that we have so many protests? Very quickly, very quickly.
Can I just say this? Because of 1976, I suffered. I was tortured. I went through pain, you know, and that pain, though, brought about 1994. Whatever 1994 brought to us. But the point I'm trying to make, it is a form of protest that brought about 1994. And it seems as if our government, the new government, seemed to be to have not decultured many of the 1976, you know, culture of protest. They always listen to only if women were only listened to, allowed to be heard, only when they marched and they were they had to ask for the president to take the memorandum. And
I'm going to interject both of you. We have a young clip. Some young activists still believe in the power of protest, of course, to effect change. Let's hear from Mcebo Dlamini. This is what he's had to say about protests.
The country can't come to a standstill because the president is not there. He will see us and he will be told by his colleagues in Namibia that things are happening in your country and probably you must rush back and entertain the demands of the young people. And the presidency, there is a deputy president and they are comrades like Batabile and Nkosazana who are in the office of the president. Definitely someone will and must receive the demands. It is a test of the political will.
All right, I've got 2 minutes left on the show. Okay. Did Mcebo, did he accomplish 10,000 steps in a day, which is great for health and vitality? Or did a protest like that, one-man show, walking to the union buildings, does it accomplish something?
It will.
With your final remarks.
It definitely will accomplish something. It will only have accomplished its main objective once Kaya is released from prison as the only fees must fall standing prison at the moment student activist. But outside of that, more importantly, what protest does do, it allows us to be citizens in South Africa. It allows us to be able to engage in the politics of the country. And it allows us to challenge authority and to challenge government directly.
Point. I was going to say...
Briefly.
I mean, we're protesting with the president. The president has these marches all the time, these walks, you know, on issues of...
Do you see that as a form of protest?
In a way. Let me just tell you something. The president, just the last one in Vilakazi Street, had all the business people, had to march with the business people to make a point.
She's rolling her eyes. She's rolling her eyes.
I know. But the point I'm trying to make is that now, you know, protest come in... Cebo walked alone. You know what I'm trying to say? The Khoisan people slept in the union buildings.
Yes.
And so protests take different forms. Other people believe in Sobukwe, bend, you know, ID, the pass laws and all that. So what I'm trying to say is that it also depends on the form in which that particular protest, it is the shape and form
sure.
it is taken.
All right. Well, before you head out to the next protest, remember it has to be peaceful in order for it to take place without any permission from the authorities or the powers that be.
But they
We
mustn't
have
shoot. They mustn't shoot. The only problem I have...
That is that we have run out of time.
Just
My
let them
producers
shoot and
are going to
them.
kill me.
They must kill
That's where we wrap up our show.
protest.
That's where we wrap up our show for tonight. News is up next with Marcel Gordon. I'm with this unruly bunch here. Good night. Have a lovely weekend.